Fire and fury inside the Trump White House. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I read it. We're going to talk about it. Hi, this is Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, I went back and forth on this, gentlemen, about whether to read this book, to not read this book. I read the sample chapter, then decided not to buy it because I thought I shouldn't give my money to somebody who would write about this, and I don't really want to encourage anybody else to write things like this. And nevertheless, I realized that millions of people are in fact buying it and possibly reading it, although probably not the president himself, who's getting verbal briefings in short bursts from his associate Hope Hicks. But in any case, I did read Fire and Fury inside the Trump White House, or at least 217 pages of it, so long, right here on my trusty Kindle device. And I don't want to dig into detail by detail or the blow by blow stuff you're seeing in the headlines here, but I think it is a fascinating idea. How do you deal with history that's being written in real time from people who, you know, frankly, are not exactly sourcing everything that they say? Like, I'm also reading Thomas Jefferson biography right now, a 6-volume biography by Dumas Malone about Thomas Jefferson, and it's got footnotes out the wazoo so that everything he says he documents. But in case of Michael Wolff's book here, most of it is Michael Wolff hanging around the West Wing, overhearing conversations, dropping in on people, not really making clear that he's writing a book, just kind of eavesdropping. He's kind of like what would happen if you and I just went to the mall and walked around a while and then wrote down everything we heard. And so, Stephen Green, does somebody like Michael Wolff have an obligation to perform the role of a journalist, or is it okay in this day and age to write what is in effect a gossip column? And by the way, I say that in the highest and best possible usage of that, in the fact that it's probably saying a lot of things that really happened.
Well, you know, we have a First Amendment for a reason. Nobody's under any obligation to do anything or to write any particular thing or in any particular way. Michael Wolff is pursuing his First Amendment right in what I assume is a very profitable way, and I guess more power to him. There's a wolf in a hen house joke, though, here. We always knew the Trump White House was going to be chaotic, and letting this guy into the White House is certainly a sign of that, because it's you let this guy in and then that book comes out. It's like letting the wolf, I know Fox, right, but wolf into the hen house and going, hey, where's all my chickens at? Like, you're really surprised. I mean, we know who this guy is and the kind of things he writes. It'd be like, okay, my wife works for a major corporation, like a Fortune 10 company, probably, if I had to guess their ranking there. And it would be like her wandering around the office, listening to other low-level employees talk, and from there, writing a book about the CEO. It's about that level, because he was on, Michael Wolff was just on CBS today or yesterday, Monday or Tuesday, saying he didn't talk to Mike Pence. He didn't talk to any cabinet officials. He may have talked to the president, but the president didn't seem to be aware of who he was or what he was doing in the White House. So really, you've got a guy wandering around the West Wing, picking up gossip and making of it what he would.
Well, and there's a lot of infighting going on. I mean, in the book, a lot of it has to do, or at least in the first 217 pages or so, has to do with the internecine battles between sort of the Bannon division and the Jarvanka division, as they referred to Jared and Ivanka Kushner, the president's daughter and son-in-law, and then Reince Priebus and Paul Ryan and that sort of little wing. Bill, here's the challenge now, and again, I'm only 217 pages into it, so maybe it's going to take a dramatic turn in some way that I didn't anticipate. But even though, as I'm reading, I realize that he probably didn't do any sit-down interviews, and he doesn't claim, Steve, by the way, he doesn't claim, hey, I did sit-down interviews with cabinet members, or I did a sit-down.
As I said, he went on CBS and said, yeah, I didn't talk to anybody important.
Yeah,
I made up that quote, but I think it's a good summary of what I overheard him say on CBS.
Well, yeah, and that's right. You should come clean with that, Steve. But when Norah O'Donnell asked him the question directly, did you interview any cabinet members? He said, no, I did not. Did you interview Vice President Pence? No, I did not. So he's not like being sneaky about this. And the book doesn't claim that he did. He pretty much says he was a fly on the wall at the White House. And so anyway, Bill, the challenge I'm having with this is, even though I know this is largely unsourced, uncorroborated material that's a one man's point of view based on what he claims to have overheard or seen or been witness to or been part of conversations about that, it comes across as, it rings true, if for want of a better term. I mean, his description of how things are going, I mean, is the president a narcissist BSer? Yeah, the president is a narcissist BSer. I'm not saying he never did anything good. And in fact, Michael Wolff credits him with the things that he did effectively or did well. But basically saying it's an organization that is managed not at all, really. And it's a bunch of people fighting with each other, and the president reluctant to make a call on anything and more concerned with how he's viewed on TV than any particular policy issue or anything else having to do with the job. And so when you see that, do you immediately have to jump to the president's defense and go, well, it's just left-wing bias, and the only reason why it sounds reasonable is because you read the Washington Post, Mr. Ott?
It seems to me that this book is a tale told by an idiot, full of fire and fury signifying nothing. And let me explain to you what I suspect is going on here, and I'll try to keep this brief because this is a bit of a tale. But as you know, I've always been at war with conspiracy theories and so on, and I've always just found them incredible. The moon landing conspiracy theory, 9/11 was an inside job, all the rest of it. But in my youth, I believed in things like the Chariots of the Gods, Loch Ness Monster, Bermuda Triangle, and so on. And I believed in these things because I read the books that promoted them. And the books that promoted them make a compelling case. And then only later do you find that this compelling case is completely obliterated because of the 200 data points on the field. They pick 4, and these 4 are an extremely compelling case. For the Bermuda Triangle, for example, I discovered that if you take an area the size of the Bermuda Triangle, place it anywhere else on the world's shipping routes, and you will find as many unexplained disappearances as you find in the Bermuda Triangle. End of that argument. Chariot of the Gods used a picture on the Nazca Plains of Peru of a hummingbird with lines in the wings that were kind of parallel. And Eric von Däniken said, could this be an ancient airport? Could these lines be used to park aircraft and so on? As they do in this picture of jets lined up, at this military base. And then somebody said the hummingbird is 14 feet across or something like that, And that's the end of that argument.
Very tiny alien invaders, Bill.
The most recent example for me of falling into this trap was I saw a documentary called Last Will and Testament, and it was based on, it was released in cooperation with a feature film called Anonymous, and it discussed the Shakespeare authorship issue. And I have to tell you, after watching both the documentary and the feature film, I spent about 24 hours utterly convinced that Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, was the man who actually wrote the works that we attribute to William Shakespeare, otherwise known as Shakespeare of Stratford. And so I was
one of our backstage shows, I think.
100%.
And on your recommendation, I watched the movie. It was quite good.
100% convinced of this. And then I did something for which I'm very proud, and it carried the same kind of emotional kind of an onus that you described in our backstage show as well, Scott. I decided that I should read the other side of the argument, and I didn't want to. There are some things you want to believe, and these things are very powerful. And when you find a line of evidence that suggests that the things you believe are true, it takes extraordinary effort, and extraordinary character, if I do say so myself, to go against what you want to believe and find out what the counter argument is. And then I read a book called Shakespeare in Fact, which utterly destroyed the De Vere argument. And just to give you 2 small examples, just to wrap this up, one of the most compelling arguments that the De Vere people made was they showed their 6 surviving signatures of William Shakespeare. The names are all written in a scrawling hand, and there's no way that hand, forget that a hand like that could have written as many words, not even, Shakespeare's. Well, we find out that 2 of these are from his will, so he's lying there dying, and the other 4 apparently had to be written on very thin strips to fit inside some sort of leather constraints or something like this. The other thing I found compelling was that Shakespeare's 3 daughters were illiterate. Who could believe that a man like William Shakespeare would have 3 daughters that are illiterate? Surely it must be the Earl of Oxford. But as it turns out, he says everybody's daughters were illiterate in England in 1615, 1618, 1619. The move to educate women didn't start for 50 years. And so these things that seem so compelling usually have very simple explanations. And then the question we have to ask ourselves is, does the author know about this contradictory evidence? And is he lying, or is he just such a slave to the emotional belief, the emotional desire to believe in it? And I think that the Kennedy assassination and 9/11 and the Shakespeare authorship question are based on our desire for justice. That we can't handle the idea that some loner, just some absolute loser, could take out the most charismatic and powerful man in the world. Gerald Posner in Case Closed makes this point. He says the reason we want to believe these things is because on one hand you have John F. Kennedy, so powerful and glamorous and beloved, and on the other hand you get this scrawny little loser in the form of Lee Harvey Oswald, and we want to add something to Oswald's pan. We want to add some weight to him to make this tragedy balance. I only bring this up to say that there are emotional drivers for what we believe, and this book is the first of many that is going to go appealing directly to that mood, and go directly to that bank, and collect money from telling people a few facts that seem irrefutable, but when in context, they're absolutely, completely explainable.
And just to back up what Bill's saying, or part of what Bill's saying about conspiracies, there's actually a quote in the book, which I posted to Facebook the other day, that I said, plausible moment from this book, where Steve Bannon is saying that the allegations about a Trump-Russia conspiracy are preposterous because there's no way that the Trump organization or campaign could have put together a conspiracy.
That rings true.
See? That's just, and you know, there is a plausibility to Michael Wolff's book, and I think it's useful it's out there. So if you want to read it so that you know exactly what the book says and not just the stories about what the book says. I mean, you got to watch out for that too, because the coverage will tend to focus in on a few isolated quotes. Somebody said this about somebody else, but that's not really the thrust of Wolff's argument in the book. I don't read it as history because it's not presented as history. It's presented as an extended gossip column, not a particularly leftist work, other than in the general sense that it is, reflects badly on the Trump administration. But it doesn't come across as being an ideological thing. And in fact, one of the arguments that Wolff makes is that by and large, the Trump administration is not particularly ideological, with the exception of Steve Bannon, who's now gone. So, Jared and Ivanka are essentially Democrats, so there wasn't really any driving force other than Bannon, who was an ideologue, and Trump himself certainly never, even pretended to be such a thing. So anyway, I think it's not a bad thing to read it as long as you can read with a sense of context. And to just double up on what Bill said about the other side of the story, every page I'm reading of this, I'm constantly thinking, I wonder what I would hear if the similar kind of guy had similar access to the Bush White House, to the Clinton White House, to the Obama White House, to the Reagan White House. What really goes on behind the scenes? There's a book called The E-Myth, where basically the author said if you went behind the curtain at almost any major impressive looking corporation, you'd find that it's a daily scene of chaos as they try to cobble together their product and get it to market. And so, nobody really likes to see how the sausage is made, but there it is being laid out for the world to see. I will end with my favorite quote from George W. Bush, who is purported by Michael Wolff in Fire and Fury to have said after the Trump 16-minute inauguration speech, "Now that was some weird stuff." Except the president apparently didn't say stuff because, again, that rang true. I felt like George Bush would certainly say something like that. Anyway, if nothing else, it'll be worth it for the comedy value. Feel free, if you do read the thing, feel free to note in the comments section, what you found interesting about it or offensive about it. And but I suspect most of our comments are going to be why you think I'm a communist for reading it. And that's okay, too. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the team here at BillWhittle.com and the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.